Hello, and welcome to our last panel entitled Critical Virtual Exchange. What does critical mean? My name is Liudmila Klimanova. I'm an assistant professor of Russian and Slavic Studies and Second Language Acquisition at the University of Arizona. I will be moderating this session, and I will get us started with a quick introduction of the topic, and then we will proceed to the introduction of the first speaker. So critical, what does it mean and how do we conceptualize critical in the context of international education, intercultural education, and virtual exchange? I will first want to think about some of the definitions, some of the things that we think about when we talk about critical. Well, first of all, critical immediately comes to mind when we think about critical thinking. And critical thinking is defined as a fundamental skill that we need to develop in learners. And it is defined quite broadly as critical thinking as the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. There is even more to this definition. Striven and Paul in 1987 continue saying that in its exemplary form, critical thinking is based on universal intellectual values that transcend subject matter divisions, clarity, accuracy, precision, consistency, relevance, sound evidence, good reasons, depth, breadth, and fairness. Wow, this is quite a bit, quite a few categories and competencies to cover in just one definition, critical thinking. In the context of critical pedagogy, we look at critical from a slightly different angle. And this would be, and I apologize for this, this would be in connection to critical social theory that conceptualizes education as a place where we can examine different practices where inequality and injustice are performed or reproduced. And this is from back 2005. In connection to virtual exchange, we think about critical when we talk about transformative learning experiences. So what we need to do, and I hope we will do it within this session, we will consider critical as we conceptualize virtual exchange, particularly as a transformative learning experience. Well, secondly, when we think about critical, we think about promoting critical-oriented exchanges. They go beyond banal interactions to engaging students in topics of substance, topics that will lead to social change and will encourage students to think more critically about their own cultures, about the cultures of their partners, about social issues and practices that are not of equal nature in their communities. Thirdly, when we think about critical, we think about power relations, how power is performed in linguistic practices and educational practices, and how inequitable practices can be reproduced when we organize intercultural virtual exchanges, and how we can promote civil learning and conflict resolution, and how we can promote a call for social action in and through intercultural virtual exchange. Next, we think about critical in connection to giving access, critical as allowing more participants, more audiences, more students in more parts of the world to access intercultural virtual practices and learn from these practices. So the critical can be also referred to the question of access. Next is, of course, task design and how we conceptualize task design in connection to civic awareness and how we can promote equitable social practices through task design in intercultural virtual exchange and intercultural virtual education. And finally, the question of English, to what extent it is legitimate to use English as lingua franca in virtual exchange, and what types of practices, unequal practices, do we reproduce by encouraging students to use English, and what other alternatives do we have and do we promote as researchers and teachers, instructors, to encourage participants to share their cultures rather than adopt dominant practices in education. Okay, so to conclude this brief introduction, I would like to refer back to Claire Crump's critique of the national standards on the teaching of foreign languages, where she draws our attention to questions of local versus global. And she talks about local knowledges, local mindsets, and asks a legitimate question: how do we teach local knowledges, local mindsets, and local languages through a global set of ideologies regarding language, culture, communication, and learning? How does this relate to the way we conceptualize virtual exchange? Well, we conceptualize virtual exchange in terms of global cultures. So what is the place of local cultures in our understanding of virtual exchange? This is something that we can discuss as part of this panel. And I want to conclude with a quote from Klimanova and Helm, where they discuss virtual exchange in connection to critical pedagogies, and they say virtual exchange has been touted as a central pedagogical tool in developing students' intercultural competence, intercultural skills. And if so, if virtual exchange is to deliver on these promises, it needs to move away from its problematic roots in superficial interactions and also in its nationalist orientation. We can discuss all these approaches to critical as we listen to 3 wonderful presentations that we have today in this panel. And I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is Francesca Helm. Francesca is a researcher at the Department of Political, Juridical Sciences and International Studies at the University of Padova in Italy. Her research interests are in intercultural dialogue, virtual exchange, technology in education, language education policies, ethical internationalization of higher education. She's currently working on the monitoring and evaluating of the European Commission's landmark Erasmus Virtual Exchange Project, also known as EVA project. The project was launched in January 2018. And has been seen a very active participation. Over 2,000 young people participated in the project from Europe and also from the Southern Mediterranean region. Please join me in welcoming Professor Helm. She will begin our discussion of what critical is in the conception of virtual exchange. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the invitation, Liudmila, and it's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here at this conference event. I'd like to start with talking about criticality as a constant questioning of our practices. This is what I'm thinking about critical thinking. So questioning what we're doing and looking at our complicity in supporting inequitable education systems and societies. So I suppose in a sense, what I'm going to do is talk about all the questions and doubts I have about what I'm doing. And what I've learned from many critical scholars and friends of mine is the importance of making explicit our locus of enunciation. So where is it that we're speaking from? So my geographic location is Italy in Central Europe, Fortress Europe, if you like. Italy is on the north side of the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean is one of the largest cemeteries of the world, where every year hundreds of people die as thousands are making the hazardous crossing across boats. The Mediterranean is where institutions such as the European Commission and national governments have stopped saving lives and are actively breaking international law and the law of the sea by ignoring alarm calls or pushing people back to Libya, a prison where we know many people from sub-Saharan Africa are sold as slaves. Europe is funding and training Libyan patrol ships to stop people trying to cross and come to Europe. My locus of enunciation is also where NGO and citizen platforms have stepped in to do what governments are not doing or have stopped doing, and they're being criminalized for this activity. In the last 3 years, a civil fleet has been created with ships carrying different flags, Italian, German, Spanish, connecting and coordinating with one another, supported by using social media and digital technologies and platforms to communicate and to support transnational crowdfunding and awareness-raising initiatives. So the kind of activities that earlier John Reinhardt was talking about that we maybe could be looking at. And so at the same time, for the last 3 years, I've been working on a project funded by the European Commission, that same Commission that in many ways is supporting the notion of a fortress Europe. And so this, in some ways, it makes me feel uncomfortable. So the project, as Liudmila said, is the EVE project, Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange. And the aim was actually to have 25,000 young people, not 2,000. So there were 25,000 young people participate in virtual exchange activities in the 3 years of the project. And this is, you can see the website of the page, the European Youth Portal, which is where it is hosted. And actually, this project was strongly supported by the political branch of the European Commission, the Counter-Radicalization Unit, in the wake of terrorist attacks, which happened in Paris and in Brussels in 2015, and which led to a heightened awareness in Europe of the social divisions, both within Europe and between Europe and its neighbors, in particular, Southern and Eastern Mediterranean countries. It was this counter-radicalization unit and the political branch that then involved other units, in particular the education unit, who actually, to tell you the truth, haven't been too interested in the project. For them, the priority is student mobility and the creation of a European higher education area. So the aims of the EVE project are here on the slide. So I don't think I will read all of them to you, but it's about linking young people, youth workers, youth organizations from Europe and Southern Mediterranean through online learning activities in order to strengthen people-to-people contacts and intercultural dialogue. So it's promoting intercultural dialogue and increasing tolerance, a word I don't really like, through online people-to-people interactions, building on digital youth-friendly technologies, promoting different types of virtual exchange. So there are various models of virtual exchange, what you know as telecollaborative types of virtual exchange, and also facilitator-led virtual exchanges. Enhanced critical thinking, so we have had a definition of that before, and media literacy, particularly in the use of internet and social media, to develop resistance to discrimination and indoctrination. Fostering the soft skills development of students, young people, and youth workers, including the practice of foreign languages and teamwork, notably to enhance employability. Supporting the objectives of the Paris Declaration to promote citizenship and common values, and also strengthening the youth dimension of the neighboring policy. And so as we look at these aims of the project, there are two main discourses, if you like. What I kind of call the neoliberal slant, building the competences of individuals for employability, and then the social cohesion agenda. And so virtual exchange is finally being promoted as an activity that can enhance universities' internationalization agendas. And this is something which, together with various colleagues in uni collaboration, we have been working on. We've been trying to do this for many years. And mainly due to the COVID pandemic, this year, there has been a strong increase in interest in virtual exchange. And what many universities buy into is this discourse of student employability and the idea of building competences of individual students, so linguistic and intercultural competences, digital literacy. Not so much interest in virtual exchange in terms of relationality or a way of learning about and practicing interdependence and collectivity, equity and social justice. And so what I'm asking myself is, to what degree are we in this project supporting the neoliberal university? Are we concentrating so much on promoting individual competences and the building of positive relationships, but perhaps in a kind of superficial, harmonious way to maintain the status quo? Or if we want to be critical, should we aim to be more radical? Does critical mean we should counter-radicalize through a form of activation of young people so they do not accept the status quo, not accept going back to normal or even a new normal, which isn't much different from the old normal? Does critical mean that we should focus more on making connections to anti-capitalist, anti-colonial struggles? Or can the two stand together? Another issue I've been reflecting on is the power dimension in virtual exchange. And so we like to frame it as a form of mutual learning and collaboration based on principles of reciprocity and horizontal relationships. But to what extent do we achieve this? And if virtual exchange does become increasingly mainstreamed in higher education, maybe I'm an optimist here, how can we ensure, for example, that educators aren't coerced into doing this activity, that it's really carried out on the basis of mutual learning and engagement? How can we ensure that virtual exchange doesn't become a way for universities in the global north to exploit the global south, developing projects which may engage and build the competences of our students in the name of global citizenship, whilst at the same time extracting time, information, engagement from those in the global south and even putting them at risk? Through my research on the Erasmus Virtual Exchange project, I've got to know many amazing young people, and some of whom have had this kind of transformational experience that Liudmila was talking about before. For many Europeans, their eyes have been opened to some harsh realities, migration, racism, conflicts, which are relevant in their local context, but they perhaps haven't become aware of or engaged with. And here are just a couple of slides with some quotes. Here, this is a student from Italy talking in a focus group with other Italian students who had been involved in a virtual exchange with different groups. And she's talking about her experience as she was trying to tell the people in her online dialogue group why Europeans were against refugees, were against migration. And so she says it was really difficult for her because my father, he likes Lega, it's the Italian nationalist party, and Salvini. So it's really hard to tell them what he says sometimes. I argue a lot with him. They, her group, supported me feeling empathy, telling me I shouldn't be ashamed for what we're doing and for what a lot of people think. And so telling this boy's name in Syria, who was studying architecture, who'd love to travel and study abroad, but he can't because there's a war, how can I tell him that most people can't accept him? But then at the same time, this experience gives her the opportunity to talk about them. So she started to tell about him, to talk about him. He's in Damascus. And so the project gave her the, if you like, the way to be in contact with somebody and to bring his experience, the experience of other people to her community in Italy, and perhaps try to change other people's perspectives, not just her own. And here we have a student in Syria, and again, who is happy to take part in the project, but for him, the issue is not feeling safe, not being able to express their ideas freely. And here he's talking about a classroom, but he's talking about the virtual exchange, where there was another Syrian in his group. And he says, maybe me and Naima, it's another name, are in the same city, but maybe she's connected to political foundations in my city. So if I speak freely, unfortunately, some sensitive topics such as migration, why people want to go out of Syria, this question could have many answers and relative to many reasons, and this could harm he and my career inside Syria. So it's complex and it's risky and it's difficult for a lot of people. And so related to the point about horizontal relations is the concept of ecology of knowledges, a notion that the Portuguese scholar Sousa Santos writes about, and the idea of engaging with radically different ways of knowing and being, and if you like, doing. And the question is, can we do this from within the university? Can virtual exchange and its embeddedness within universities, its reliance on technologies, and very often English as a lingua franca, can it allow us to engage with different ways of being and knowing? Or is it going to reproduce and continue the situation that we have at the moment? Can we use virtual exchange as a tool for building transnational networks and politically engaged students? who can recognize the harmful and unsustainable and inequitable systems and institutions that we are living now. And I suppose this is what I'd really like virtual exchange to be, or critical virtual exchange to work towards. And this is why I've put this picture of a happy picture on the Mediterranean, one of the boats in the Mediterranean. This is a possibility of what we can do and what people already are doing through creating transnational connections using technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. We will leave some time for questions at the end of this session. And in the meantime, I want to ask to introduce our second speaker while he's setting up his slides. This is Professor Joseph Cunningham from Georgetown University. Professor Cunningham is currently director on the undergraduate curriculum at Georgetown. His research program is situated at the intersection of technology-mediated second language pedagogy, instructed pragmatic development. His research has appeared in a variety of journals, peer-reviewed journals, and also in many edited volumes. In addition to studying the benefits of virtual exchange for second language learning in teacher education, he's also interested in the role of telecollaboration at the curricular level. He currently serves on the editorial board on the Journal of Virtual Exchange, and as well as he's a member on the executive board of Calico, the computer assisted language learning consortium here in North America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cunningham he will give our second talk in this panel.
So thank you very much, Liudmila, for the invitation to join the panel discussion today. I'm very excited to be here. Yeah, so let's jump right in. So the question of critical virtual exchange and what does critical mean? So since this is our guiding question, I wanted to start with it. And in that regard, I'd like to turn to a discussion of the multiliteracies pedagogical framework as presented originally by the New London Group. They note that 4 curricular components, situated practice, overt instruction, critical framing, and transformed practice provide the pedagogical structure to organize multiliteracies instruction and engage learners in acts of meaning design. So you'll notice here that I've bolded the idea of critical framing because that's the way today that I'll engage with the broader notion of criticality in virtual exchange. So after a few opening remarks along these lines, I'll also present just a little bit of data from a study that I did recently that may help to illustrate the points that I'm trying to make. Okay, so what the New London Group refers to as curricular components, Paisani and co-authors refer to as pedagogical acts. And I'd like to briefly explain these pedagogical acts. So we have, for example, situated practice, which provides learners the opportunities to immerse themselves in spontaneous language use. We also have so-called overt instruction. And here, learners systematically analyze formal and functional features of texts so that they can use them to construct meaning on their own. As far as critical framing goes, and again, I'd like to remind you that this is really our explicit focus. Here, we are trying to get learners to reflect on the relationship between the design of meaning as it pertains to texts and the communicative, social, and cultural contexts in which these texts arise and emerge. And finally, we have transformed practice, which involves the creation of new texts based on existing ones or reshaping texts to make them appropriate for new contexts of communication that are different from the original. Now, what may seem to be sort of a linear progression here vis-a-vis the model you see on the screen may actually be a little bit misleading, because the idea is that the pedagogical acts aren't supposed to happen in a particular sequence, but rather in an overlapping and contiguous manner, depending on the focus of instruction at any given time. So at this point, I want to connect the pedagogical act of critical framing within a multiliteracies framework to the systemic functional linguistic tradition. Now, systemic functional linguistics is very detailed, and for those of you who are familiar with it, you understand this. For those of you who are less familiar with, I'll attempt to give a very brief overview of SFL. So in this view, language is seen as a social semiotic resource that people use to accomplish purposes by expressing meanings in context. So in other words, language users produce utterances or texts within a particular social or cultural context to get things done. And these texts simultaneously communicate meaning along three different axes: the ideational, the interpersonal, and the textual. So ideational meanings are connected to the notion of field and are concerned with the propositional content of an utterance. In other words, what's actually going on. Interpersonal meanings are more concerned with the social roles and relationships between participants and is connected to the tenor of a text. Textual meanings pertain to the mode of a text and are concerned with whether a text is written or spoken, whether it's monologic, dialogic, etc. And all of these language-specific aspects are shaped by and constrained by the greater context, here represented by the notion of genre and register. And I'll return to the notion of genre in just a moment. So, as far as critical framing goes, we see an important overlap between it and SFL, namely that language use or meaning design is impossible to disambiguate from its context. And as such, critical framing activities should help learners to understand how text is embedded in a particular context, while at the same time, that text influences the context from which it arose. So this reciprocal relationship. Also briefly, I would like to introduce to you the idea of appraisal theory. So because language is understood in SFL to be systemic, the organizing principle is system rather than structure. And in this case, we're dealing with the system of appraisal. So appraisal is comprised of three interrelated domains: attitude, engagement, and graduation, whereby attitude can be further subdivided into three regions of feeling: affect, judgment, and appreciation, whereby affect entails resources for construing emotion, judgment entails resources for assessing behavior, and appreciation entails resources for construing the value of things. So with all of that as the background, let me say a few words about the study now. So I wanted to know what attitudes are on display as two student teachers negotiate the selection of a text and the development of a task in the context of a virtual exchange. So essentially what we have is a virtual exchange happening between graduate students at Georgetown University and graduate students at the University of Trier in Germany. But both participants on both sides of the exchange happen to be first language speakers of German. And so the communication with one another is in German. So this exchange that we're going to look at, this hour of data, happens within the context of a task cycle where the ultimate goal is for the team to select a text and to develop accompanying instructional materials and tasks within the multiliteracies framework, which is why I spent some time talking about that in order to contextualize this study. Here we can see some global findings from the study. So a total of 683 C units were produced by the participants, and about 1/3 of them included an expression of attitude. So in each case where attitude was expressed, we determined not only the type of attitude, but also the target of that evaluation. And as you can see, fully 90% of the expressions of attitude were connected to texts, tasks, and instructional materials. And in each of these categories, appreciation is the predominant kind of attitude expressed. And that makes sense if we recall that appreciation is connected with construing the value of things. And to kind of make that a little bit more salient for you, I prepared a couple of examples to help illustrate what this looks like. So in this first example, we see an evaluation of two potential texts in terms of the connection to a particular historical context. While one text is evaluated as a nice example, it's also characterized as not really offering enough. On the other hand, the second text is deemed more appropriate because of its historical connection and depth. So these evaluations, in turn, are reflective of the expectations that the teachers have for their imagined learners. Namely, they want to engage them in the kind of critical framing that helps to situate a text within a particular socio-historical context. In this next example, we see an evaluation of a text, of a potential text, in terms of its generic structure. Essentially, the speaker is judging the text as unsuitable for further consideration due to the fact that it's not typical of the genre that they would like the students to produce in a subsequent task. So again, if we think about SFL and genre as being one of these contextual strata, then we can also kind of make that link to critical framing again. So this exchange makes clear that the student teachers are considering the text in terms of its connection to the wider context through its typicality. Put another way, they're anticipating that their imagined learners will need to engage in some sort of critical framing to connect the text with typical generic stages of songs, because that's the genre that they're referring to here. And that connection can't be achieved through the text under discussion as the learners see it, because it's not representative enough of that particular genre. So in this last example, we have an evaluation not of a potential task, but of a potential task that emerges from an understanding of text. But again, here, the discussion centers around this notion of genre as an important and salient contextual feature of a text. So while the task should build off of the text in areas such as theme and genre, here the task idea is evaluated to be too close to the original text, to a degree that the imagined learners might not be able to fulfill another of the pedagogical acts discussed previously, that is, transformed practice. Put another way, the task should be not just a reproduction of the same exact kind of text that the learners have previously worked with, but should instead feature some distance from the original text, so that the learners can construe meaning in new and original ways while still within a familiar context and having access to the attendant language features that would go along with that context. So to wrap up, let me reiterate that the goal of the study was to better understand the attitudes that two student teachers displayed during their interaction as part of a virtual exchange task cycle. During this hour of interaction, the participants expressed a range of attitudes towards a variety of targets, offering insight into decisions regarding text selection and task development. As regards text selection, the participants focused variously on quality, complexity, and cultural significance as important factors. And tasks, in contrast, were evaluated in terms of their originality and their complexity. So in sum, by evaluating themselves and their own ideas, as well as those ideas of their partner, the participants could negotiate and co-construct a mutual understanding of text selection, materials development, and factors governing related pedagogical decisions within a multiliteracies framework. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion following the final presentation.
Thank you so much, Joseph. We are moving on to our next and last panelist. Our last presenter and panelist is Professor Carmen Ramirez. Professor Ramirez is assistant professor and the founding director of the online Spanish program at the University of Arizona. She teaches upper division and graduate level courses on a variety of topics, including online course design, international education, world languages for specific purposes. Dr. Ramirez hosts an academic podcast series entitled World Languages 21 that highlights leading scholars' views on education, research, and curriculum design. Her publications include the forthcoming book, Online Language Teacher Training and Assessment, and co-edited volume, Transferable Skills for the 21st Century, Preparing Students for the Workplace Through World Languages for Specific Purposes. She also published very extensively in a number of peer-reviewed journals, and she has a few book chapter publications as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ramirez. She will give the last and final talk in this panel. Thank you.
So today I want to talk to you about academic culture and its influences in virtual exchange. And I'll tell you, as I've been thinking about this presentation over the past few weeks, I continue to go back to it and modify and add to and decide the direction I want to take. So you'll see that it has been influenced even in these past 2 days by some of the speakers that we have had in our symposium. So giving the question we have for this panel, which is, what is critical virtual exchange? I want to talk about critical exchange from a perspective of who is in the exchanges, how they're carried out, and then at the end, I'll tie in some of the studies that I've carried out in Mexico. So bear with me. I know a lot of you have been at this longer than I have, but just to give us a context of what we're talking about with virtual exchange as part of this larger movement of internationalization that we're seeing in our universities, really across the globe. In broad strokes, right? We have in the 1970s really a push for the internationalization of curriculum. How do we add in more international materials into our local and national curriculum? And then in the 80s, we see the development of international networks, of course, one of the most famous being Erasmus, which we've heard about this project on a couple of occasions from different speakers over the past week. And then in the 90s, we really get a more push from universities for student mobility, getting students to study abroad, right? All of these initiatives to get more and more especially in the US students to study in other countries. And then again, I'm talking about physical presence at this point. So what we know is over the last, let's say 50 years of internationalization, both of the curriculum and at a university and administrative level, is that international education thus far has been quite exclusive. What I mean by that is the majority of students who participate in, and I am speaking from the perspective of the United States, the majority of students who participate in international education and exchange programs are white. They're, of course, English dominant, as well as the exchanges. And I know Francesca just talked about that, and we question that, right? Also, we're using Western educational models, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the second half of my presentation. And then the fourth point, a lot of our educational exchange, both the exchange itself as well as the research that we have about international exchange and international education is really motivated by a lot of research coming out of Europe and about study in European countries. So I have this information from NAFSA. And again, we are still talking about, at this point, you know, face-to-face exchanges, but we'll see how this trickles through to virtual exchange in a moment. The majority of students in the US who are taking study abroad experiences, and this data comes from 2017, 2018, so it's only about 2 years old, 70% are Caucasian, right? While Caucasians only make up 56% of the students enrolled, 70% of those taking international education opportunities are Caucasian. And any group that falls behind, so our minority groups in the US, such as African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, multiracial, American Indian, I mean, we're not talking about it's a close second. We're looking at huge differences in the numbers. So really just minimal numbers when we talk about our minority students who are participating in international education experiences as compared to our Caucasian student population. And then again, going back to this idea of a lot of the international exchange activities as well as research being really based on Europe. We can see that here. These are the host regions, so where students in the US study most frequently. And we see Europe is about 55% of the total students who are going abroad from the US are going to Europe. And again, we're not talking about a close second, way in the back. We see Latin America, Asia, and some in Africa. So again, really strengthening this concept of this being an exclusive process historically. Now, when we come into this was data from the 21st century, but what has come up in the 21st century that hopefully is going to help us to be able to catch up and mitigate some of these differences, if we do it, of course, in a critical and responsible way, is the digitalization, right? So in the 2000s, 21st century, we really have so much more access to digital tools, right? So a lot of our virtual exchange interactions are happening through email, they're happening through different types of asynchronous tools. And then as we get further into the 21st century, we're now talking about critical use of tools and technologies, and being able to use those to really close this discriminatory gap that we have, right? All of these students who are being left out in these regions of the world that really are left untapped by a lot of international education initiatives. So the critical view of the who and how in virtual exchange. And as I told you, I've been taking bits and pieces of information because the presentations have been so wonderful over the past few days. So yesterday we heard from Shannon Swaro, who talked about the Evolve project. And I took a screenshot of her map, so I hope she doesn't mind. And here we have the participating countries, right? So there were 16 virtual exchanges, 34 partners, 20 countries. We do see Taiwan, Indonesia, we see one Latin American country, Brazil, and then again, we see a big concentration of a lot of this being powered by students and intellectuals from Europe, which is amazing. But we see in other parts of the world really a need to do more research and have more involvement from the students. Then we heard from John Reinhardt this morning, who talked about the medium as the message. So the importance of not just looking at who is participating, but also looking at how they're participating, right? And obviously the way in which we can participate, what we have available to us, is going to completely transform the entire exchange experience. What we know, talking about access, is that we have 4 billion people in the 20 countries represented here with limited or no internet access. So again, it makes sense that a lot of our research and a lot of our exchanges are based in these areas, these regions of the world that are really highlighted in green as to having quite a bit of internet users and internet penetration. Again, going back to my area of research, my area of the world, when we look at Mexico, Central America, and several parts of South America, we see that the internet accessibility and the tool usage and the tool availability there is much more limited. So it is not the same, right, to do an exchange with someone in Europe as to do it with someone in a Latin American country in most cases. And that leads us to another point that was made by one of our panelists yesterday. And she talked about Mexican students' experiences with online education for the first time during COVID. And what did she point out? Well, she pointed out what we're seeing here on the map, what we're seeing really verified through various different types of information, is that it is much more difficult in certain parts of the world, specifically in this context in Mexico, to be able to participate in virtual activities for various reasons. So the survey that she quoted being that they surveyed 301 students on Facebook in the spring when they had to do their transition to online education for the first time. And while 82 students responded, and they all said, yes, they have internet access at home. However, the bandwidth was not what it needed to be to really fully participate in the activities. And another factor to bring in is that they didn't not only have the resources or the materials at home, but the university didn't either. So she mentioned cases of professors trying to drive around town and find internet access, professors who didn't have computers. So again, a really quite different context than what we're looking at in many parts of the more developed nations. So I'm going to transition a bit from giving you that context of who's included and who's excluded in a lot of our virtual exchanges. And I want to talk about the underdeveloped areas of research. So, and I'm going to focus on these two in red, right? Partnerships between developed and developing countries, and the influence of sociocultural and institutional practices. So this is where I'm going to tie in this piece about academic culture. As I stated earlier, my area of research is Latin America and Mexico in particular. And I'm going to share with you some of the outcomes of research that I've done there. And I specifically want to highlight findings from these two studies. There's an article of mine that came out in 2019 that was based on global citizenship education through a COIL initiative with a university on the Mexico border and the University of Arizona. They're only about 40 minutes apart. And then here in an article that was just published this past month in Foreign Language Annals, I specifically targeted the influences of academic culture in a COIL project that was carried out between the University of Sonora and the University of Arizona. So two different universities in Mexico and two different projects, but I'm going to pull from both of those to discuss this influence of academic culture and how we can critically look at what our current practices are and how we can improve. So organizational culture and climate, so important because we have academic culture, which is what we can see, right? A lot of this are things that we can observe with not being intimately knowledgeable about an organization. So we have the rules, the practices, the infrastructure, right? And a lot of this, you can even look online and see what they have. I know when I called my partner in Mexico and we were discussing how we would set up our virtual exchange, I said, do you have a computer lab? And she said, of course. And I said, okay, let's reserve it because I'm going to want to have a backup in case students that don't have internet at home or don't have a computer at home. So we reserved it, to then find out later that yes, they had a computer lab. However, the activities that we had planned didn't work because the computer lab didn't have a microphone, it didn't have web cameras, it didn't have the things that we would consider basic in a lot of our US and European universities, right? So the miscommunication, again, from the assumption of what their computer lab may look like as compared to my computer lab at my university. We also have the influence of academic climate, and academic climate being a little more elusive because we really need to get to know our partner institution to understand the academic climate. So a lot of times we're knee deep in the exchange before we start to really grasp the influences of things like teaching styles, how students and teachers interact on a daily basis, how students interact on a daily basis in their university context, and productivity. What does it look like? What does a successful assignment look like? Even sometimes when we're using the same grading rubrics, right? If we're coming from different cultural backgrounds, we have major differences in how we view something that is acceptable or unacceptable on an academic level. And this all comes forward when we look at these more longer term syllabus sharing virtual exchanges. So I'm going to focus on 3 challenges to finish this last part of my presentation. So integration of technology. So in my findings, the LMS and the learning management system that has become so ingrained in our academic life in the United States, they use that very sparingly in Mexico. They have one they use at the university I was at, they had Moodle, but some of the students had never logged into it. When the teachers did post to Moodle, a lot of times it was like a syllabus and readings, and it was really more used like a repository to be able to put the course materials, but it wasn't how we use it in the US, where really everything goes through that LMS. So the culture of using it, of accessing it, of checking it every day wasn't there for the students in Mexico. And of course, that is problematic when you are planning a virtual exchange that is based on an LMS that we're expecting students to exclusively work through for their coursework. We also, again, going back to that, the culture of use, right? Going back to what we spoke about this morning with our keynote, the students didn't have that culture of use for the learning management system in the Mexican university. So not only did it make checking it cumbersome, but also the different tools we were using, such as discussion boards, seemed very foreign and difficult for a lot of our students in Mexico. Hybrid and online classes. Currently, at that time, this was 2 years ago, there were a handful of classes that were being offered online at the University of Mexico, but they weren't in the languages department. So our students in the United States who are participating in this binational semester-long course, they were used to taking online classes. Most of them had taken several online classes. So this is a fairly easy transition. And then our students in Mexico, again, a huge learning curve for them. And something sometimes we don't think about, but when we really get into these long-term virtual exchanges where we're sharing learning management systems, is the tech support. So the students in Mexico had very limited tech support, and the tech support they did have was 9 to 5 during the week, compared to our students who had 24/7 tech support. So huge differences in the tools that were available. Curricular planning. Another thing we don't hear a lot about, maybe doesn't make for super interesting research, but something that as we start to think about how to, again, take into account these populations of students who aren't historically part of virtual exchanges, these are things that are key to making this a successful exchange. So unlike the United States, the students in Mexico, and I know in several countries, they have a fixed curriculum. So trying to have an academic virtual exchange that a lot of times we get funding for, or it's something that might be a one-off, you do it one semester, right, as part of a study, it becomes very, very difficult to do this, to integrate this in a way that students are going to be able to participate in a way that they're excited about, that seems relevant to them in their course of study, especially if that course of study has been set out for them since their first year and their third year students. And this is what happens in many cases. As to where in the US, it's much easier to implement these virtual exchanges in a program where you have a lot of elective courses. So in my 2020 article, and talking about student perspectives, the takeaways that students had from participating in this virtual exchange, why did you decide to enroll in the course, right? So going into the course, your attitude about how you were enrolled or why you were enrolled is going to affect also your perception of the exchange itself. So 6 out of the 15 Mexican students said it was mandatory. I didn't decide to do it. My coordinator told me I had to do it, put me in the course without consulting me, right? And then another student says, you know, the original course that we had programmed was changed because of this course. Again, talking about not having the flexibility in long term. And then there was a student who also said, so you see student B says, she said it was an experiment. So the students are going in with their schedules completely changed for something that we're thinking is a wonderful opportunity, but the way it's being packaged and given to them is setting them up for, you know, almost a negative experience. And in the United States, we see comments such as, you know, that was a great opportunity. I wanted to interact with students from other countries, etc. So challenge number 3, pedagogical approaches. So teaching styles, and this is part of that academic climate we talked about, things that at first may not be that visible or seem to be that different, but as we get more involved into the exchange, we start to notice these stark differences between our teaching styles and our course content. Again, out of the 2020 study that was just published in Foreign Language Annals, I took this chart, and the red here is, you know, this is not equal. What we had is we had just very different opinions from our US and Mexico group. Their takeaways were completely night and day. So we asked them about course design. What did you think about the course design? Some overall comments were from the Mexican students. They said, we didn't like the course design. It wasn't academic enough. It has little meaning to our professional development. It didn't feel like a university level course. And the content of this course, and I'll tell you, was actually looking at digital media, and it was critical digital media consumption. And they were asked to look at different ways that their countries were portrayed in the media coming out of their home countries. So again, this also being a very different approach to education, a very Western approach. We talk about it maybe more in European and US universities, about this critical education and looking at social justice topics, and we're bringing that in, but that can feel very foreign to some of our virtual partners. The topics were boring. The partner activities were inconvenient. They don't have, again, this culture of being sent out to do activities and report back. It was less structured than what they were used to. On the flip side, we look at the United States, and the students said, it was good, there wasn't busy work, the topics were interesting. So very different takeaways from the exact same course. Moving forward, I'll have to say, despite some disheartening feedback from the students in Mexico, both groups of students, 100% said, 15 of the 15 in Mexico and 14 of the 14 in the United States, that they wanted international education opportunities, right? They really did want to participate in this type of binational course, and they feel like it should be part of their university experience. However, they were somewhat let down with this particular experience because of the way it was designed and set up in things that we have just discussed, right? All factors. Multiple perspectives. So here's another positive takeaway. In the 2019 study that I published, we talk about in that virtual exchange, it was a bit different. We specifically focused on topics that were pertinent to both countries. And we did quite an extensive unit on NAFTA, because during that time period, NAFTA was being renegotiated between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, right? So we took these current events that were pertinent to both of our countries and discussed them. And we really do see there was some real transformational learning going on. Connections were being made that students hadn't made before. One of the students from the US says, before the interview with my partner and the videos, I didn't know anything about NAFTA. After the interview with Liudmila, I learned a lot about how NAFTA affects the population of Mexico. Liudmila works in a company that makes automobile pieces. She says the workers there are not being treated with respect. So not only are they hearing another side of the NAFTA discussion and how it affects people in Mexico, but he actually was paired with someone who has an insider view from working inside of one of these factories that is supported by the NAFTA agreement. Another outcome, along the same lines of critical thinking and making these connections that we really consider part of global citizenship, realizing that what we do here affects people across the world, right? Especially when we're talking about what we're doing in the United States and how it affects our neighbors on the other side of our border wall. What happens here in Tucson really affects the people of Sonora. An example would be shopping. When Mexicans know that it's Black Friday, they come and they take advantage of the sale. Another example would be politics, like NAFTA, given that Trump wants to renegotiate NAFTA again with Canada. So students now are looking at current events and not just thinking about how it's affecting them personally, but how it is affecting people in other countries. So the three questions I'd like to leave you with, because I know we're going to go into discussion, so perhaps we'll have time for that, is how can we accommodate partners at different stages of technology integration in their universities? So our partners that have academic cultures that don't integrate technology in the same level and intensity that we may in our home institutions. Curricular planning. How can we plan sustainable iterative exchange projects that aren't just linked to maybe one grant opportunity or one course that we teach every 5 years, but actual courses that can be given semester after semester and then integrated into our partner institutions that have those more fixed curricular planning styles. And pedagogical approaches. Are we integrating teaching methods that represent both universities? And of course, for this to happen is where we really have to become intimate and knowledgeable with their academic culture and their academic climate. And I'm going to leave that there, and I hope we'll be able to continue our discussion about this shortly.
Thank you so much, Carmen. We don't have a lot of time left for the discussion, but we do have a question from Chantel to all panelists. And Chantel wants to know what you're thinking about this. If you were talking to someone who is thinking of starting up a virtual exchange for the first time, what advice would you give them based on your research and based on your experience with this form of teaching and this form of intercultural education?
I'll take that. It sounds like no one else is taking it. So, you know, and I'll answer this also from a program director perspective, because we are incorporating a lot of virtual exchange in our online courses. And the biggest problems that we seem to have is students' expectations. So having students, number one, understand, yes, you're going to participate in a virtual exchange, but what are the rules of conduct and what are the expectations? Remembering that you're probably working with someone who's going to be in a different time zone. You may be working with someone who is going to have tech problems. So just like, you know, in our conference here, and a lot of us are coming from the same country with people from across the world, setting up their expectations, because I can tell you, when you do that ahead of time and front load them, it seems like they're not as let down or frustrated when they do run into these problems. And I'll let my colleagues continue to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you, Carmen. So my advice, I guess, would be for people who would like to begin with virtual exchange to start small and to really have a realistic project with maybe a pretty limited scope, so that there are because because there's so many different layers to a virtual exchange in terms of not just the logistics and organization, but the pedagogy, the mediation while it's happening with the students, the communication with the partner teacher. So if you're doing it for the first time, I would say if you have a limited scope and a project of maybe shorter duration, maybe 4 to 6 weeks as opposed to 10 to 12 weeks, then you gain the experience of having done that, all of the valuable learning that occurs from having experienced that. And then I would say maybe prepared to reflect on that and hopefully re-engage with the process again.
Yeah, no, I agree with both of those things. And then maybe I would add, in terms of a partner, I think finding a partner that you can talk to, understand each other, exchange values, ideas, and visions. And you don't have to be from the same disciplinary field. I think a lot of really interesting COIL exchanges are interdisciplinary. And I suppose as language teachers, we're lucky because we can be quite flexible. But I think finding somebody that you can have a kind of good working relationship with and get to know each other before starting the exchange. So just like we say for students, they need to build up a relationship before collaborating. I think the same goes for the kind of partnering educators too.
Excellent, thank you. I have just one last question, and this is a question from me so we can wrap up this discussion. I want to go back to this idea of critical. Do you think the notion of critical will be changing encompassing more variables, more sides of virtual exchange in the future, especially now that we live in this world of, in the state of crisis, and where we, I think we turn to online teaching and virtual teaching a lot more, not as a serious, substantial method of teaching, but rather as the venue of last resort, because we're just not able to run face-to-face classes anymore. What do you think about critical? Is it going to change the idea of critical virtual exchange in any time in the future? And if yes, in what way?
Well, maybe what I'd like to do is kind of flip that question a little bit and maybe suggest that we need to take a much more critical view of what's happening in-person instruction. And, we've all been, even those of us who aren't necessarily technophiles, forced into an online education situation. And this really provides an excellent opportunity to examine the practices that we've often just relied on through cultural and institutional memory in our classrooms, and to really think about, okay, what is it that we're doing in the online space that we can sensibly integrate into the classroom space to really optimize our instruction?
I think also the ideas, I think somebody mentioned the pedagogy of care. I think the idea of building relations through online learning and really engaging, because I mean, now we're all kind of sick of Zoom and being online, but I think having an environment where you have this kind of care for building relationships is what perhaps we've been trying to do in virtual exchange, which perhaps isn't happening in other online classrooms. And so criticality will look at the kind of relationships we can build through technology.
Excellent.
I'm hoping, again, I'm an online program director, so I can see both sides of the coin. I know I have colleagues who are still quite resistant to online education. So my guess would be as soon as we can go back, they'll be jumping at the opportunity. However, I am hoping that we start to, within our departments, within our colleges and universities, talk more about how these types of virtual exchanges can be integrated more long-term and more systematically. I know it seems to be that you might have one person in the department who's interested in it, so it's being implemented in their class, but it's not being implemented across the board as an actual value that we have, or part of our overall program. And that's something that now that everyone has had the experience to teach online and we're more familiar with these technologies, I'm thinking that now would be the time to really start to advocate for these being programs that are integrated on a more programmatic level and not just here and there.
Excellent. Well, I would like to thank all of you, Carmen, Francesca, and Joe, for your wonderful, insightful talks. Thank you so much, and good luck with your research and with your virtual exchange initiatives. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.